Good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us. Greetings and welcome. I'm saying evening because in New York it is evening. Welcome to the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. My name is Uzma Rizvi, and I'm an Associate Professor of Anthropology and Urban Studies at Pratt Institute. In my role as chair of the board of the Anthropology section, New York Academy of Sciences, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us from all the various places and times you may be from. This evening in New York City, we are excited to present as a part of our 2020-2021 programming on reimagining resilience, a conversation between two brilliant scholars of our time, Professors Deborah Thomas and Bianca Williams. This conversation, entitled, "What is the utility of anthropology in this moment of emergency?" will draw from their own experiences in and of the discipline to reflect upon the extent to which anthropology offers tools to make sense of and find our way out of emergencies. They will discuss what drew them to the field, what their continued investments are, and how they attempt to make the discipline accountable to who they are. If the urgency of this moment demands that anthropologists use our tools not only out there in some faraway place that is considered the field, but also right here in the places we work, sleep, and eat, then anthropologists must be prepared to turn the lens on themselves, their departments, their professional organizations, and their funding agencies. How might contemporary discussions about white supremacy, anti-Black violence, and class disparity allow us to do some deep thinking about estrangement, alienation, and engagement here at home? Are anthropologists ready for this kind of radical honesty? And this indeed is the question, right? And this question has a deep history. And it's a question that continues to be asked of the discipline, importantly and insistently so. I wonder if the politics we write and theorize about within our ethnographies, within our archaeological work, within our bioanth, within whatever part of the field we are engaged with, those politics, when we write about them, are they also the politics that we practice? I think of Faye Harrison's book, originally published by the Association of Black Anthropologists in 1991, Decolonizing Anthropology, Moving Forward Towards an Anthropology of Liberation, which brings these same questions to the forefront and works towards creating solidarity across the global South. And even though that was nearly, I can't believe it, nearly 3 decades ago, the echoes of that continue to resonate. And more recently, I was thinking about it in relation to Ryan Jobson's Year in Review article, The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn. And of course, all of this within the context of the special section of the American Anthropologist on the anthropology of white supremacy that was edited by Aisha Beliso de Jesus and Jemima Pierre. And all the conversations that such work has engendered. And many of you have heard these conversations. We've been having these conversations. So it's quite ripe at the moment. So we invite you to consider this conversation as one that is within this history of discourse, and to keep in mind this conversation is not nearly over. No matter what form of relief this weekend may have inspired, and certainly it released a lot of pressure, the work of undoing racism, contending with patriarchy, understanding the deep roots of settler colonialism within the nation state, and calling a stop to anti-Black violence is something that absolutely must continue. And we as the Anthropology section have insisted on a commitment to such work. Of course, in order to ensure all of this programming can happen, we rely on grants and sponsors. And so I'm just going to kind of slip this in here because it's important to acknowledge our support. We've been supported by the Wenner Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and Bergen Books, and we thank them for supporting the Anthropology section. Equally significant, if not more consistent and constant, is the Board of Advisors for our section. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the many hours of work done by our board on these events. I particularly want to thank board member and vice chair Matt Riley and our treasurer Ryan Rome, as well as our anthropology section fellows, Anna Sergeva and Miriam Leitner. Without all of them, none of this would be possible. I would like now to turn to introduce two remarkable scholars, creative thinkers, and women who have shown through their own work how to be a responsible and rigorous academic and a person in the world. Deborah Thomas is the R. Jean Roundley Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center of Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a research associate with the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. Thomas is the author of Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Sovereignty, Witnessing and Repair, Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. Also co-editor of the volume Globalization and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness. Her articles have appeared in a diverse range of journals, from Cultural Anthropology, American Anthropologists, Radical History Review, Anthropological Theory, etc. From 2016 to 2020, she was the editor-in-chief of American Anthropologists, the flagship journal for the American Anthropological Association. She has served on executive boards of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, or USWA, the Caribbean Studies Association, and the Society for Cultural Anthropology. Prior to Thomas's life as an academic, she was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bushwomen. Bianca Williams is an associate professor of anthropology, women and gender studies, and critical psychology at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Her research interests focus on Black women and emotional wellness, race, gender, and equity in higher education, and Black feminist pedagogical and organizing practices. The investigative thread that binds Williams' organizing, teaching, and research is the question: how do Black people develop strategies for enduring and resisting the effects of racism and sexism while attempting to maintain emotional wellness? In her award-winning book, The Pursuit of Happiness, Black Women, Diasporic Dreams, and the Politics of Emotional Transnationalism, Williams argues that pursuing happiness is a political project for Black women, while examining how African-American women use travel to Jamaica and the internet as tools for escaping US racism and sexism. She is co-editor of Plantation Politics and Campus Rebellions, Power, Diversity, and Emancipatory Struggle in Higher Education with Diane Squire and Frank Tuitt. That should be coming out in March 2021. Finally, Williams is faculty lead of the Publics Lab at the Graduate Center and the executive program chair for the 2021 meetings of the American Anthropological Association. Before I hand this off to both of our guests, I wanted to let you know that we will be live tweeting during this event at NYAS_anth, A-N-T-H. So if you are so inclined, please do join the conversation there. To become part of our growing community, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Same handle, it's at NYAS_anth. You can like us on Facebook, join our email listserv, and become part of our vibrant community of anthropologists. Finally, throughout the course of the webinar, you can post questions in the Q&A section on the lower bar of your Zoom menu, or if you are on YouTube, in the comments section. We will be collecting the questions throughout the program and hope we can get to as many of them as possible through the course of the panel. In case of a breach of security, we have a secondary Zoom ready. So if something were to happen, we will close everything down. It'll take us roughly about 10 minutes to reassemble. In that time, please check your emails for the new link. We have all of that automatically set up, but we just need to make sure that you are aware that that will happen. And keep in mind, it might take some time to kind of get all of us back together. So with that, please join me in welcoming Deb Thomas and Bianca Williams for this conversation. What is the utility of anthropology in this moment of emergency? Thank you.
Thank you, Uzma, for that great introduction. And thank you to the anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences for having us. Hi, everyone who's here. Thank you for using your evening to sit in this conversation with us. And hi, Deb.
Hi, Bianca. I'm just going to ditto Bianca's thanks to everybody, to Matt, to Uzma, to everybody at the New York Academy of Sciences Anthropology section for bringing us together and to put me in dialogue with the fabulous Bianca Williams, who was one of the very first graduate students I ever taught at Duke University, because we arrived at Duke together.
Yes, I'm so thrilled. So thrilled to be in conversation with you. I was just thinking about how that doesn't feel like it was forever ago and how it was a bit of a while ago. I won't say how long, but it was a while ago. And so, yeah, I'm honored to be in conversation with you. Before we start with the questions and conversation that we had planned, I wanted to ask you, just because we're in this moment, like, how are you feeling post last week? How are you feeling about this particular moment? I know Philly folks were out in the streets, hopefully social distancing with masks on, but how are you feeling about this moment?
I am feeling like this. I'm going to show you how I'm feeling.
You have media tools and support.
No, that's not what I have. Oh, man. No, I have
Philadelphia.
Flipadelphia. Don't
Yeah,
I have,
we can
yeah.
see it. Is that what you show us? Yes, I see that Philly folks were fully feeling their part in this election.
Philly folks were feeling their part, and was also feeling pretty proud to be a Philly person, transplant. At the moment, obviously, there's quite a bit more to be done, but a lot of relief, I have to say. I was trying to think about how one could survive another 4 years. How are you feeling?
The last few months have been really tough, COVID wise. Police violence and state sanctioned violence against Black folks. It was just a really rough year. And as someone who's been trying my best to use all my training and my skills and supposed gifts to help organize a tough 5 years, and so I didn't expect to feel so much relief this past week. I mean, I know folks on here may be of a variety of political beliefs and backgrounds, but this past week I was surprised at how relieved I felt once the results in the election have been called. And of course, I'm one of those folks who's like, don't get comfortable. We got plenty of work to do.
Exactly. There's plenty of work to do, but at least there's now a series of mechanisms through which one can imagine doing it.
Right.
As opposed to the alternative, which just kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier and more extractive and more coercive and more insecure.
Right. And to be honest, as Brooklyn really, I mean, I'm in Clinton Hill in the Fort Greene area. Just seeing everybody else's kind of joy and relief collectively.
Yeah.
Because I've been in my apartment for months now.
Exactly.
So just to be able to see and hear that collective spirit was so nurturing and it fed. So I hope that all of you who are joining us tonight have been able to be in at least communication with, if not in a physical presence of other folks who are feeling some type of, joy, at least relief in this moment. I think that emotional conversation about what we've been experiencing, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually is really important. So I hope you have that. But I wanted to start by asking you, Deb, how did you get here? Like, how did you get to anthropology? Why are you here?
Why am I here? That is a good question. This is Philly, right? You can hear it on Broad Street. So I tell people often that I'm a kind of accidental anthropologist, and I think actually many, many of us are. Those of us who find our way through circuitous paths to the discipline, never sort of set out to do it. And honestly, I didn't actually know that there was a discipline called anthropology or a space of ethnography. And I had been, as Uzma said in the introductions, dancing with urban bushwomen, and prior to that working at Crossroads Theater Company, and had sort of moved to New York to be part of a Black arts scene in the late 80s. And, all of my energies were there. And I think, I had lived in Brazil for a year as well. And I was really interested in the ways that dancers were drawing from Afro-Brazilian music and dance styles from candomblé and other kinds of traditional practices in order to incorporate it into kind of a modern idiom, or to think about a political project today, and they were at the time sort of big into the resurgence of their Movimento Negro, and also the kind of Black arts pride that was happening just at the same time where in the US we were sort of in the culture wars, and multiculturalism was sort of the buzzword, and it seemed like we were going in very opposite directions. And I was really interested in that and in how artists were part of those processes of social and political change. So when my parents asked me, which they did every year, how much longer are you going to dance? Are you going to sign the contract another year? Might you ever do, something else with your education, et cetera, et cetera? Then I sort of laid out this path that I was going to do kind of independent research across the African diaspora, looking at how artists were involved in movements for social change, because that's something that we had been doing more and more of. Also with Bush Women, we were doing these community engagement projects using dance and music as tools for other kinds of mobilizations, right? Consciousness raising, community transformation, etc. So I thought I would apply for individual grants to do that. And my father said one day, well, I don't know this for sure, but maybe if you did that in the context of a university, someone would pay you. I thought, that would be good. So I just started doing research and does anybody know anybody in graduate school? Does anybody, have you done this before? Because I hadn't, obviously, and my family hadn't. And so there weren't really any models. And a friend of mine, James Bernard, his sister, Emily, was in grad school at Yale at the time. And I went to visit with her and she put me up and introduced me to all of her friends who were not super happy actually at the time. But I thought, well, if they can do this, I can do this, And so I applied to the kind of program that she was in, which was an American Studies, African American Studies hybrid. And then when I was online for a movie at the Angelica one day, I thought, what if I don't get into Yale? Maybe I should also apply somewhere here in New York. And there was a NYU bulletin in the lobby. And so I looked for the same programs and applied and just sent in the application. So I didn't get into Yale, and I did get into what was then called American Civilization at NYU. And when we were with Bush Women at the time, we were touring 35 weeks out of the year. And so one of the times when we were home in New York for a week or two, I set up a meeting with the then chair of American Civilization, who was about to retire. And they were in the process of an enormous transformation, which ultimately resulted in them hiring Andrew Ross and completely turning a very traditional kind of US literature and history program into what became, the American Studies that we know at NYU. And he suggested that I take my application over to Latin American and Caribbean Studies, since it seemed like I wanted to do this diasporic thing. And so I walked down the hall and checked it out and just fell in love. They seemed so welcoming. I thought, I found my people, and they found a little money for me, at least for the first semester. And so I signed up and I started there. And my very first class was an anthropology class. And I should say that I was a week late starting graduate school because I wanted to do this last gig that we had with Bush Women. It was a residency in Oshogbo in Nigeria. And we had written this big grant to do a site-specific performance in the sacred groves of Oshun, which I didn't want to miss, obviously. So I set a meeting with the professor when I came back because the course was permission only of instructor. And so that professor was Connie Sutton. And she sat down with me and met with me and she said, so I don't think I can let you into this class because it's really an advanced graduate student seminar. You're not even in anthropology. Why do you think you'll be able to keep up? And I said, well, I've done this research and, I lived in Brazil and then, all these different things. And she ultimately said, well, why are you a week late? And I said, oh, well, I'm a dancer with this company and we were in Nigeria. And she just beamed and she said, you're a dancer? I always wanted to be a dancer, and she had, of course, also conducted research in Nigeria. And that's how I got into her class. and, completely fortuitously. And she really then spent a lot of time sort of helping me to learn how to think like an anthropologist, molding me into somebody who could read for argument, who could sort of get through these literatures and understand what was going on. And I was so turned on by it because she had done this research on West Indian migration to New York. And I thought, wow, this is something people do. This is like my life, like people study this, people have language for this, and they had a method for stuff that I thought I was already doing. So I just felt like I wouldn't have ever sought it out, but I landed in the right lab. And thankfully, she was somebody who really took the time to work with me and to, shape this little kernel of something that I had into something coherent and legible to other people. And also really brought me into a community of Black women anthropologists. She had the next semester organized the speaker series, and she brought Faye Harrison and Lynn Bowles and Gwen Michael and Brackett Williams. And, each time I would get to go to her house and sit with them and meet with them and talk with them and sort of develop this sense of who my role models could be, within the field, and who I could, she created a path for me to follow, basically. And it's really because of that I landed in anthropology, as I said, quite accidentally. But, I found a home. That first class, I don't know if you felt this way, Bianca, but like my first classes, I didn't understand what I was reading. I was like, my first book with her was David Harvey, Condition of Postmodernity. And I was like looking up every word in like the first paragraph. I thought, this is ridiculous.
Here.
It's like, I'm an educated person. I can't get through like a page of this book. That's how much work I had to do, Anyway, she helped me figure out how to do it, and also how to suspend disbelief with some of the older anthropological work that just seemed really opaque to me on so many levels, and that didn't seem like I could understand where some of those anthropologists were coming from when they were writing about the people that they were writing about. So, it was really the right place, the right time, and the right advisor. I can't imagine I would have found it another way. And I think probably you have a similar story, Bianca.
We probably have a similar story in that, being first generation college educated, being 1.5, Jamaican, my mom is Jamaican, and I had no idea what anthropology was, pre-applying to Duke. And I have, my story of how I came to anthropology as an undergrad was that back in the day when you got into college, they sent the hard bulletin of the courses home, and I was the nerd who like went through the entire course bulletin book to see what I was going to major in. I was determined to be a lawyer. I made my Caribbean family happy and wanting to be a lawyer, and every course that had race in it, that I was like determined I wanted to be a civil discrimination lawyer. I was focused on race and culture, and every course that had that was this thing called anthropology. And I was like, I don't know what it is, but I'm going to go and figure it out. And so I double majored in anthropology and political science. And similar to you, and I think to probably a lot of people on this call, particularly marginalized folks, the significance of good mentors and good teachers who bring you into the discipline was how I got here. Lee Baker, if you're here. Lee has been my mentor. Oh my gosh, it's been over 20 years now. I walked into his class. I remember I was like a sophomore trying to get into an upper level class, and he was like, maybe you can do this, and he let me in. And he's the one who throughout, like professionally, throughout my career has always, whenever I get to a crossroads, he guides me through the discipline and through kind of higher ed. And so.
Me too, by the way.
Yeah. And so I think, while the academy, higher ed very much like kind of dismisses or belittles the significance of teaching, it's super important to how we get people into the field, how we recruit folks who are going to be future anthropologists. Because I know if I hadn't found him and if he hadn't guided me through, I definitely wouldn't be here. And then the other part is Charlie Pio taught my intro to culture anthropology course. And I remember before going home for fall break or winter break or something, he did an analysis of all the holidays in the US, like that Halloween, I call it the Day of Thanks for political reasons, Christmas, like that analysis of those holidays. And he taught us how we learned about gender roles and about capitalism through these holidays. And I remember being like, this is something where you can pick up any kind of cultural rock and look under it and begin to understand not only the world, but your positionality in it. And so anthropology for me was learning a way of seeing and listening and like being aware in the world. Baker's the one who introduced me to Zora. And I think most Black women anthropologists who end up being in this discipline and staying have a Zora Neale Hurston story. Zora Neale Hurston and Elizabeth Chen's Purchasing Power. I remember so clearly being in his intro to African-American, maybe it was intro to African-American thought. I don't remember what it was, but I remember reading Elizabeth's work and being like, we can study Barbies and learn about class and race and gender through, toys. It was fascinating to me. And so the gift of ethnography, the gift of being able to understand that my communities, I went to church in Eatonville, Florida. Zora's home place was where nearby where my family was living. And so this idea that Black communities, both American and Caribbean that I grew up in, were knowledge makers and had analysis in our everyday life was what brought me to the discipline. And that I could see that knowledge produced, like through Zora's work, through other folks' work by teachers who introduced it to me, was why I got here and why I stayed. And I'll just say again, that community of Black feminists, anthropologists, both my peers, but also the folks that I could see ahead of me, is what kept me here. Because a lot of people come into this discipline, get their BA or maybe even their PhD and leave. But folks like you and Lynn Bowles and Faye Harrison, Ashante Reese, Savannah Shangay, Donna Austin, Danaine Davis, like so many Black women that I see throughout my different interactions with the discipline, those are the folks that feed me and keep me here.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, probably I know this is true for you, and I know it's true for a lot of Black women because I have this conversation constantly. I think we do a lot when we're critiquing our field and we're critiquing our discipline, and we're always sort of on the heels of do better, be better, recognize the need for accountability for these various histories, right? But then when we're in interdisciplinary spaces, and this came up when we were talking before, we're defending it constantly. So we always have to think about what are we defending? What is it that we feel keeps us here? What is it that we think is so important about an anthropological approach to really the world, and to imagining our place within the world? And I think it's just that, what you're saying, always the recognition that people and this is a Zora thing, and this is how anthropology has always been, even in its more conservative in past incarnations perhaps, but it's always been the one disciplinary space that has valued and taken seriously people's own ways of organizing their lives, their communities, their institutions, and the ways that they've theorized about the world. And I think that that's really what keeps us engaged, right? Because there's a space for that kind of respect and elaboration.
Yeah, I guess I would say there's people who create that space.
Yes, of course.
Right. So I think when I went from Duke as a graduate student, I had you and John Jackson and Lee Baker all in the same department. And then an amazing African and African American studies department that was, anthropology adjacent in a lot of ways. And so when I went to AAA for the first time, one, I had no idea there was that many even anthropologists in the world. So I was like, what is this? But then I realized very quickly that the way that I was brought into anthropology was a very specific way of being brought in, and that all of you and the other folks who taught me that interdisciplinarity, the women and gender studies, the Black and Africana studies, the Caribbean studies, those other lenses that you all brought to the anthropological work is what made me feel at home. If I'm going to say anthropology is my home, that's what made me feel at home. And so the significance of those interdisciplinary lenses as not only frameworks for knowledge making, but survival, like in the context of feeling various forms of violence or exclusion or marginalization, being able to combine the ethnographic tools that I loved about anthropology, the storytelling, the seeing, the listening, with the kind of community connection and organizing of Black studies and feminist studies was what made me feel like I could survive and breathe in this space. And I know there's a lot of people who haven't been able to experience that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that community and that mentorship is what's so key. I mean, it definitely is what was key about ABA for me and for John and for many others, you know, the Association of Black Anthropologists and some of those other spaces for sure. So when you were, when Lee was convincing you should get a PhD in anthropology, because this is the story that we heard,
yes.
that Lee was convincing you to get a PhD in anthropology. What did you think you were going to do with it? Like, how was that going to build a career or job or set of circumstances for you?
And it's funny because, not funny, but interesting that during this moment of emergency, this moment of urgency, this is what I came to anthropology for. He convinced me because one, I decided I wasn't going to go to law school my junior year. It caused some stuff with folks, you know, in my family and folks who expected me to do a particular path. And I felt like the law was not creative enough for me. And it pulled me further away from people's stories and narratives than I wanted to be. And so this moment of watching folks, not only across the US, but across the globe, really many folks who might be late to the game, like suddenly that light bulb going off and being like, oh, there's so much going on in the world. And this is what, like, from my positionality, what I can do with it. That's how he convinced me. He was like, I can give you, you know, texts, I can give you frameworks and lenses so that you can make sense of not only what you've been experiencing, but what your community has been experiencing. And then you can go do something with it. You can teach about it. You can, for me, it was always activism and organizing. I always say I spent a lot more time in meetings and protesting at Duke than in class. And he was an advisor who was very supportive of that. So both, like, he always wanted me to apply the tools that I was learning in the classroom, and I could get away with, you know, not turning in a certain paper or turning it in late, maybe with less penalty, if I could use the tools that we were using in class and apply it to what was happening on campus. And so for me, anthropology has always been about activism and organizing. It doesn't make sense for me to be here if I can't use it to do that. And I think I have been both grateful for the training that I've had in this moment of organizing during 2020, and also disappointed in how I feel like as a discipline, we could be and should have done a lot better at utilizing our tools to do more in this moment. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But for me, it was always about activism and organizing, which looked like creating kinder, more generous and brave learning and teaching spaces, whether that was in the classroom or off campus. You know, I used to organize with BLM, Black Lives Matter in Denver. And what was significant to me was using anthropology to kind of teach in community and figure out how to translate that. The critical race lenses I was using in a classroom to activism. And activist anthropology, whether it was like the UT Austin genealogy, that so many of my peers who are my cohort or maybe the cohort behind me, like that legacy of Black activist anthropology is what I hoped to use and contribute to as an anthropologist.
Yeah, yeah.
What did you want to do with this?
Oh, well, the second part of my father's advice really had to do with, what I thought the various moments of research would lead to, which was opening a community arts center in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. So, he thought again that maybe if I got a PhD, someone would give me money to open a community arts center. So it all kind of always for my family, it comes back to like, how are you going to support yourself? In what way are you going to be paid for this kind of endeavor? So I thought that's what I was going to do. And, that's what I came from. That's what I was going to now be able to do better I thought, as a result of my PhD training. But then there was a ad that came out for a postdoc fellowship, a Mellon fellowship at Wesleyan University at the Center for the Americas, that they were looking for someone who did cultural production in the Caribbean. And it was just like the ad had been written, to me. And so I thought, oh, well, I guess I should apply to this. And I did get it. And then that, that tracks you in a certain way. And so I began to see academia as maybe a path that could allow me to do some of the other stuff that I wanted to do in addition to the stuff that my responsibilities, as a professor, which is, I found out that people get PhDs to become professors, like in the elevator, overhearing other anthro grad students, like my second year in grad school. So it just really wasn't on my radar, that was sort of the career I might have. And I feel like now with the center we've been able to develop here, the Center for Experimental Ethnography, which is a center that really supports and promotes creative research practice, so people who are using film or performance or sound or other kinds of creative methodologies as research tools, not just for research dissemination. I feel like, in a way that's all sort of circling back around to where I started, I suppose, which was, somebody who straddles these different vectors, it's like straddling the arts and academia, straddling nation states, being mixed racially, straddling families, all of that kind of stuff. And so I felt like this was a space in which I could, with support, with community, with mentorship, develop into something that would serve people like me, and create a place so that other people who, have some of those same experiences or have experiences that are far afield from those experiences can feel like they're welcome and they're comfortable, that anthropology is a place that can be a big enough tent to also hold their various experiences and dreams. I think when I first got to Penn, I had a meeting. There's a center here called the Netter Center, which organizes kind of public partnerships. And the head of that space, Ira Harkavy, had found out about me and asked me to lunch and was telling me and was doing like a hard sell on the importance of being involved in the community and using the university as a tool for community empowerment. And I just kept looking at him like, why are you working so hard to convince me? Like, isn't this what everybody does? This is like a no-brainer, And then I realized Duke was very different, as a space at that time in that place from what we originally came into at Penn. Penn also has changed over the, 15 years that we've been here. But at that time, there was much more of a wall, I think, or at least an imagined wall by many in my department, some of whom are no longer in the department or no longer with us, but that, just the way that he had to speak about the importance of anthropology, working with community organizations suggests that, in fact, not everybody feels that way. So I guess, like you, I wanted to use anthropology to create a space where that kind of work is valued.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about all the struggles that I know both of us have kind of worked through and survived and pushed through in what is predominantly white, our research one institutions. And I'm also thinking about all the folks who haven't been able to benefit from the very kind of elite resources that the institutions that we've been trained in have. And so as I think about can you maybe talk a little bit about what you've encountered in anthropology in higher ed? And I asked that specifically because what I've noticed in the past few months, the pandemic really highlighted and heightened and put a spotlight on so many of the hierarchies and the walls and the barriers that happen, of course, like in the medical industry, in the prison industrial complex, so many other industries. But because we're here, located in higher ed, I wondered how the pandemic made you kind of see some of these barriers, maybe even clearer.
Well, everybody has stories, right? And I think, one of the interesting things about academia is that, and especially, and not always, but in most of the spaces in which I have traveled, especially in the social sciences, that there's a kind of default liberalism. And even sometimes a progressivism that is assumed to be shared, among people in these spaces. And I think it's probably not always shared, but I think that more conservative perspectives tend to get drowned out or quieted toward the championing of a kind of assumed default position of being progressive, being liberal, and even critiquing that liberalism within the work. But I think it's sometimes harder, and I think this is something that you've talked about a lot, Bianca. It's harder for people to look at their own spaces with that same critical eye sometimes. So the assumption is that whatever we do is coming from a place that values the greater good, is coming from an anti-racist, feminist, anti-colonial, decolonial positioning, and therefore shouldn't be questioned. And I think, we've all been on enough diversity committees to know that the suggestions that are made over and over and over again are often ignored, not because they're not thought to be good ideas, but because they can't work. It's not practical, it's not pragmatic, it's too much. There are these other systems at play that make it difficult to diversify in the ways that are being suggested, etc. So I guess what I see is one of the things that happened as a result of the pandemic, and then on top of that, the response globally to the murder of George Floyd, was suddenly there was a recognition that some of those things had to happen. Not necessarily a recognition that many of us had been saying those things before, though I'm pretty sure if one scratched a little bit, somebody would, of course, say that, because, but suddenly I think the things that many of us have been advocating for became common sense and became funded initiatives. And even some of the things that had been considered perhaps to be more fringy, like abolition of police, suddenly were sort of within kind of the mainstream of conversation. So, of course, one has to embrace that, and one has to welcome that. I think it's also sometimes a little frustrating, because it's an awakening moment, I guess, and that's good, and I think it will fundamentally have good results. And it is also therefore supporting people who are in positions of higher administration, et cetera, who have been pushing initiatives like those that are now being adopted, are suddenly now being supported in a different kind of way. And we need that too. But, I think one of the traps of anthropology, and especially American anthropology, because of its origination with the Boasian separation of race from culture and the activist work that he himself was doing and that he was advocating, among his students, there's always the presupposition that anthropology must be anti-racist. And not all anthropology is anti-racist, and we have to create a sensibility for each other where critiques can be raised and discussions can be had that unsettle that kind of common sense and allow us to delve more deeply into the ways racist practices and racist histories merge themselves into a racist present, notwithstanding any one individual's progressivism or well-meaning feelings and ideas. What do you think?
I mean, I could write a book about this one. I think, and I know this is kind of cliche in certain, organizing and Black community spaces, but that King piece on, King's discussion of white moderates and white liberals is just really significant to me, because I do think there are so many folks in anthropology, particularly white folks in anthropology, who see anthropology as kind of like a belief system and really organize their lives in particular ways that they believe are anti-racist. And that's great as, and cite Black women. We can talk about all the movements that help folks really cite some of the rhetoric, the language, the frameworks that we need. But that in practice thing is really tough for a lot of us. But what was frustrating about the past few months was, in the week that George Floyd was killed, I think I was asked to consult or write on 5 diversity statements. And it was like all of a sudden, why I got into anthropology, the things that I got into anthropology to do are definitely not the things that got me tenure, right? The things that I committed to be a professor of anthropology for are the things that people oftentimes, and higher ed oftentimes, dismisses or belittles, And so the things that got me tenure are the things that I did to get tenure. And so it was really frustrating that all of a sudden in this moment of great suffering and Black death and loss, where collectively a lot of us were mourning and grieving, that suddenly it seemed like this expertise was needed, but the feeling was that it was going to be short-lived, that we hadn't done the work both as a discipline or as an industry in higher ed to really get to the place where, are y'all all ready to do the work? Because if you've read any of the, Faye Harrison's decolonizing and what Faye birthed, right? The decolonizing literature, the anti-racist literature, the activist anthropology literature, which lots of people cite. If you actually tried to put that stuff into practice, then our graduate student admissions would look differently, then how we delegate resources in departments would look differently. And I'm only focused on anthropology right now in higher ed, right? So anthropology is practiced in a variety of spaces where I'm sure anthropologists and nonprofit spaces, philanthropic government spaces have their own critiques of how this moment heightened some of the power dynamics and oppressions that are operating. But in higher ed, to sit in meetings with folks and to say, we are dying and we've been saying these things need to be changed for generations now. And I get that in this moment you are listening, but what are you actually willing to do? How do you actually, what resources are you going to provide? That shows that you're not only listening to me, but you're actually going to do the work. And I remember when I was in Denver organizing with BLM, this great organizer, Candace Montgomery, I think Candace is now with Black Visions Collective. We were having some issues internally with patriarchy in the group. And we were trying to figure out what it meant for Black women to lead. Like, what does it mean for a movement, a Black movement, to be led by Black women and queer folks? And one of the things she said to the group that I'll never forget was, you all have done a great job at censoring Black women's labor, but not Black women's lives. And that is what I have felt consistently, both in anthropology and in higher ed, particularly in the past few months, watching so many people be excited about our labor and be excited about the kind of reimaginings of a future world that we can offer, but really not understanding the cost of what it has cost a lot of us to not only do this work, but to keep teaching and reteaching and re-critiquing and trying to model a different type of anthropology. And until we have folks, particularly folks in power, who are willing to let go of what's tradition or how we've always done it. I've heard that a lot in the past few months. This is how we've always done it. And so we have to find a way in the pandemic to do it virtually, the way we've always done it. Instead of seeing this moment of emergency as a moment for new possibilities and doing it differently, because the way we've always done it and traditional ways are seeped in white supremacy, are seeped in classism, are seeped in patriarchy. So if you're going to be in a discipline that claims to be anti-racist or to see and listen in different ways than some of the other disciplines that we pride ourselves on being different, then you need to start doing that work where you eat, sleep, and live. And that looks like in our programs and with our students and listening. I sometimes daydream about what it would look like for departments that, particularly those that are predominantly white, to list the top 3 critiques that they've had in all the department climate surveys. Like, what have been the top 3 critiques that your folks of color and or marginalized folks have given? And if you just believe them, it was a given that their critiques were real, how would you address those things? If you just simply started there and put resources behind those things, how our experiences of training would be so drastically different.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And, there have been in the last several months people who have acted upon the statements they've released, and I guess that's what, I want to see more of. I want to see, the models are there. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. The critiques are there, the literatures are there. They have been not only for the 30 years almost since decolonizing anthropology, but way before with Anthony Firmin, with Du Bois. There is a long legacy of understanding and of creating the critique, and then, a 40-year legacy from Indigenous anthropologists and Black anthropologists of thinking anew about a process and a practice of anthropology. So there's no need to really imagine, of course we always tweak those, we always think them through for the next moment. I mean, I think that's what Ryan was doing in his essay also, both the essay he wrote with Jafari on the decolonizing generation and his year in review essay. It's like, how do we move this forward to address what's new about the contemporary moment? Of course, one always does that. But there's no need to sort of imagine that new wheels have to be created from scratch. This work has been done and the people who did it are exhausted to see it recycling again, or I imagine, So I think that's, just what you said about the listening and actually doing something about it instead of just saying, oh, it's too bad she feels that way. Let's individually support her, and instead creating a structural shift that would, change the situation for everybody would be amazing.
Well, and because these are the things that so many of us, as we go out into the field, whether that be within the US or other spaces, like people who are studying this moment of movement making, this people who are studying and writing about abolition or writing about the failures of, I don't know, public health and like everything that's not happening during the pandemic. We spend a lot of time and a lot of words and a lot of pages dictating. I always say anthropologists are better at asking really good questions that we don't have the answers. We actually don't come up with great answers. And maybe that's part of why I have this frustration about putting things into practice. But we ask good questions. And I think that's a valuable thing. And so we ask such great questions and have such great critiques of the folks and people that are out there. And we assume that we are somehow in here and not shouldn't be under the same critiques and the same lenses. Right. And so when
we inhabit a separate world.
Right. And when I think about the ways that I have chosen to engage in mentoring, students and type of like emotional labor that I willingly give because it was given to me and I benefited greatly from it, but that the different ways that particularly Black women anthropologists and Black women scholars in the academy have given and shown and modeled what it looks like to be a scholar, that so many of that is belittled and dismissed and not seen as real work. And I wish, what would it look like in your faculty meetings if people actually talked about, instead of just theorizing affect, like really had a real conversation about how they were feeling and how that emotion is data and knowledge. Like what does it feel like to be in a department meeting where we are trying to figure out how to move forward in the midst of a pandemic, but we can't talk about our emotions and we can't talk about who's being marginalized as we're having this meeting, and how, moving forward and pushing through, if we just push through in ways that go with tradition, that we replicate so many old school oppressive things. I've been saying I'm kind of disappointed with humanity at the moment that we haven't really just slowed down and paused and not tried to produce doubly in this moment, but slowed down and paused and rested to figure out how to listen to the folks who have been writing about this and organizing around this for generations and to implement something different.
I wanted to ask you something though. Well, two things actually, Bianca. One, I want to suggest that, in fact, the thing that got you tenure was also something that you love, and that book is something that instantiates the very points that you're making. Yeah. So I want to have you talk about that for a minute. But also, when we talked about this some time ago, you cited some number, which sounded horrifying to me, about the number of Black women who are full professors in anthropology. And I think I mentioned to you, I had been, complaining some years back that I had 15 tenure and promotion cases that year from every discipline across the humanities and social sciences. There was art history. If it's Caribbean, I have it. If it's AFAM, I have it. If it's anthro of the Caribbean or AFAMness or of violence or politics or whatever, and I just I was complaining to some friends about that, and they said, did you know that 2% of full professors are Black women? And then the number that you gave seemed even more shocking to me. And I think that is something to talk about. So many Black women get stuck, as they say, at associate because of all of the labor that you're raising, here, the committee work, because we want to mentor, because we're committed to transforming our institutions, but that takes the toll also in terms of not creating the conditions for those women to take on those next, roles.
So Kristen Smith, who is an anthropologist at UT Austin, who is the founder of Site Black Women, has been pulling together some work around kind of where Black women are in anthropology and how many of us are here. And we were collectively, a few of us were having a conversation about how many full professors that we knew. And so we started to kind of create this list. And I think right now we could only name 13 full professors that were Black women, and seeing that number and like there's almost no degree of separate, like this, like I know all of them and can read all of them. And so thinking about the amount of labor and again, I mean, to know that so many non-Black folks in anthropology have no idea that those are the numbers. I mean, there's probably only maybe 125 of us when you look at assistant, associate, and full, and that we know each other. And so the amount of labor, like as you're writing 15, I know most people on this call who are full are not writing 15 letters. Like that's ridiculous. The amount of labor, and again, interdisciplinary, right? So knowing that most of us, coming through grad school, not being able to get a job in anthropology because a lot of us do work that is not seen and legible as anthropology, right? It's two American studies, it's two gender studies, it's two Africana studies, it's two Caribbean studies. It's not exotic enough to be anthropology. And so ending up getting jobs in interdisciplinary departments that have a, resource-wise and line-wise have another struggle. And so not being legible in anthropology, being taken into interdisciplinary spaces, but then having a hard time getting tenure in those spaces because they don't understand the anthropological project of your work. And so just thinking about the ways that so many Black women anthropologists are being stretched when it comes to bringing us into the discipline, keeping us in the discipline, and helping us navigate it, whether it be emotional labor, but it be the real work of tenure letters and teaching particular courses. And again, in these moments of crisis, right, in these moments of emergency where lives are on the line, but even in those other moments where it's crisis to us but not emergency to everybody else, who gets called on to do the work of holding the department and the school community together. So many times it's us, and again, that stuff is not what gets us paid, but it's how we make the space less harmful for not only ourselves, but the people behind us.
I think it's also who gets called on and takes the mantle on themselves to be in positions to transform institutions as well, right? So that, that makes me think about people like Leith Mullings, again, Faye Harrison, who took on the presidency of the AAA, right? Certainly the reason that I put myself forward for editing American Anthropologist was to also have that kind of role, to create a different kind of space within that journal, not just for Black women, for everybody, to transform that into a space that was having different kinds of discussions. One tries, you're successful at some things, you fail at others, but I think a lot of women and Black women, women of color generally, take on those kinds of leadership positions that are tons of work, in order to shift, to try to create the beginnings of those seismic shifts within the institutional spaces in which we find ourselves, that we have to create things that look like us, and that sort of are having the discussions that we feel they should have, and like I said, also with the center, it's like creating these spaces where people who are coming from these other kinds of fields and can really be at the forefront of turning the institutions upside down and inside out, that those are the spaces we want to be in, so we have to make them, and it's great and it's energizing, and if you are with other people who are collaboratively minded, it's phenomenal, but it's work, It's a lot of work.
Well, and I mean, the costs are, of course, drastically different. And I would in no way say that it's the same, but being in organizing spaces, particularly where moms of folks who have been killed by police violence, in the midst of their grief and suffering, are being pushed, if they're not already organizers, right? Being pushed to help organize movements for the betterment of the broader Black community and like the rest of everyone else, right? The world, like they're being pushed to do all types of labor that they shouldn't be asked to do. And it's, as I've been writing about kind of radical honesty for this next book, both in thinking about Black feminist pedagogies in the academy, but also in organizing spaces, and thinking about organizing practices, you know, the ways that I see Black women in a variety of spaces doing all of this activist and organizing work, even if they don't realize that it's organizing work. You know, I just, there's so many ways that we kind of dismiss the cost of that. And watching what happened in this last election, watching people call on Black women to like save the US again with this ironic idea that we're doing it to save democracy. Like, I mean, I have my own thoughts about whether or not democracy is even what we should be fighting for. Like, has democracy ever existed in the US? But this assumption and entitlement to extracting Black women's labor, whether it be in hospitals, against the prison industrial complex, in your department, in your philanthropic organization, that extraction of labor without actually seeing them as thinkers, like seeing the folks, I mean, you know, those moms now understand the criminal justice system in ways that folks who haven't gone through that, they understand, like they have analysis. They have deep knowledge about how those systems work. That's what happens when you're marginalized from a system and you have to survive in it. You're able to see things that folks who are privileged in it can't see. And the ultimate disrespect is to expect us to keep teaching you about it, but then not give us resources to actually do something about it. And while, again, like higher ed in no way is the same as being in front of, you know, police and riot gear, even though we're seeing that happen on campuses, you know, my department meetings aren't that, but it's disrespectful in professional organizations, in in funding agencies, in these spaces that, again, hold the banner of anthropology, right? Hold the banner of seeing and listening differently. It's disrespectful for you to expect that from me and not give us the resources to do it. So sometimes I just want to scream, like, move aside, just not go away, because we need your input too, and we need your analysis too. All of us have different gifts, and I don't want to essentialize and say that like Black women know it all, but there are different ways that we see and experience the world. And I oftentimes hear people and see people trying to make room for us at the table, if we want to join that table, without realizing that when you accept those graduate students who are interested in critical race studies and feminist work, when you hire those faculty who are organizers and have that analysis, then you have to be ready to make some change inside the department, because once those people show up, they're not going to shut up, and those lenses don't get turned off. If you want us to do that work, you have to make room for us to do that work.
Yeah, and I think that's the barrier one comes up against sometimes, you know, that it's not that the change in numbers also must be accompanied by a change in climate and a change in structure, and it's often not. Yeah.
And, you know, if you're going to want to have, you know, the moms of folks who are surviving police violence to speak, and you pay them honoraria to speak, then you have to like actually acknowledge what they're saying and figure out a way to support what they're asking for, you know, for their humanity and for their children's survival and for their survival. But yeah, I see a lot of platform work that doesn't actually result in change, and it's extremely frustrating.
Right, because people fall into the spirit of being moved by something, but then going back to their normal lives.
It's the difference between recommendations, like we were talking about diversity committee. It's the difference between creating a diversity committee for whatever institution, whether it be higher ed or something else, and being like, you all come up with recommendations, but not allowing us to create policy, right? And I've been having this conversation with some of my colleagues because, some people were talking about kind of, particularly senior folks, not wanting to create policy, because policy means I can hold you accountable to it, that you have committed and made this commitment, and we're going to assess it, and we're going to figure out whether or not it was actually done or not in 5 years. Recommendations are things that we can make, that we've been making. I mean, any campus climate survey you look at now, for the plantation politics book, we looked at the demands that over 150 campuses had BLM protests or Movement for Black Lives protests on their campuses. And we analyzed those demands from 2015 on with the demands from the 1960s and 1970s. And they're exactly the same. Literally the only difference that we saw was that there was a call for more culturally responsive and mental health resources, right? So the awareness that emotion and mental wellness is a significant part of what's happening on campuses, that's important, that the kind of psychological violence that's happening in higher ed is really important. But literally all the other things were exactly the same. And so that tells me either we're not doing it right, or we're not listening, or something, but we need different ideas. And that also probably means we need different people to help create those ideas.
Yeah. We need a different kind of sea change of transformation. I think you say it right when you talk about the solution being embedded within the critique. If in fact we are taking seriously the theoretical position of, for example, as you said, the mother who has watched her kids be killed by the police and then must, find herself as part of a movement to transform that for everybody else. If in fact we take that theoretical position seriously, we must also then take the embedded solution seriously. And I think that's what doesn't happen, because people often listen to what are the problems, but can't develop new ideas for solutions. And that's because they're not attuning to what is the underlying aspect of the complaint. It's just seen as a complaint of numbers or a complaint of resources, but they're not attuned to what is actually underlying that. And that's why I poked you on the, what did you get tenure for? You got tenure for drawing attention to that, which is of course also at the center of the important activist work that's happening right now, in which you've been involved, is really the move away from the kind of masculinist, revolutionary, programmatic action and toward a form of participation and social transformation that really does start from the position of Black women and queer folk of color, and that takes care and affect to be really at the center of what needs to be attended to. And I think that was what was really at the center of your dissertation research and of everything that's come afterwards. So, it is like, how do you think about affect, not only in relation to a kind of theoretical proposition, but in relation to the ways it moves in the world, in the community, in the activist communities in which you're running?
Yeah, I think, so for me, my discussion of radical honesty started in the classroom. It started from when I got to Colorado, which is where my first job was in ethnic studies, and realized that, CU Boulder was 1.3% Black out of 30,000 students. And so I was teaching a course on Black women and happiness, which was based on my dissertation, and showed up to class and realized like some folks had never had a Black professor before, that my Black womanhood was like very present. And I had to figure out very quickly how I wanted to navigate the fact that my body in particular was going to be a part of the class, like of the teaching and learning experience. And so I found myself kind of doing this monologue where I discussed my various identities and how I felt like those things and those experiences were going to affect my teaching and learning in the classroom. And it started this theorizing of radical honesty, which for folks who are listening in the very short version is thinking about a type of pedagogy that's coming from a Black feminist genealogy that centers truth telling in the classroom. And so really thinks about the kind of historical contemporary things that are bringing us to that space, and being honest and truthful about how we feel when we read or discuss things that trigger a lot of emotions when we talk about oppression, like not like really pushing against this idea that that intellect and knowledge and analysis are these things that we do that are neutral, and that like emotion should not be present in the classroom, that we're like a robot so we can do this, but pushing against that. So truth telling, highlighting, and very much valuing personal narrative and experience. So allowing my students to use their lives and their communities as case studies for the things that we're discussing. Action, I've been told numerous times, folks want to read all the sides. Like they have this, like students feel like they should, how do we get all the sides of a debate? And I've heard that, again, another thing that I've heard throughout the pandemic and throughout the anthropological conversations around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, this idea that once we talk about abolition, defunding the police, the prison industrial complex, that we should have all sides present in this conversation. And so for me, radical honesty and to being honest with my students, that I expect them to take the knowledge I'm teaching them to do something with it. And that all sides may not be present, because I'm aware that in my class, they're going to get the sides that are usually not given in the other class, in the other sides. And finally, that emotion is knowledge, that it's a type, a node for data, and that what I've seen in both my classrooms and in organizing spaces, the storytelling that anthropologists engage in, the ways that people get galvanized and mobilized to participate in movements, is about emotion. And the greatest epiphanies or moments of solidarity that I've been able to witness or participate in across racial difference and gendered and sexualized differences has been emotional. Like the sudden realization that, your marginalization makes you feel this way, and this is how you're feeling dehumanized. And I'm feeling moved by your story and your experience. And so I can apply that thing to my experience in this way. And now we can figure out a type of strategic solidarity around that. And I think what troubles me about, traditionally what we publish, how we publish things, and how we teach, is the kind of dismissal and sometimes denigrating of like that the emotion is where the work is, that the emotion is where the solutions are, that these things that you hear are complaints are actually critiques that have solutions wrapped up in them. And so if you stop dismissing them as just complaints and hysterical and irrational things that marginalized people say, you'll actually hear the analysis and the solutions present in them.
Yeah. And I think also the things that you feel as transcendent can also be keys to another, right? Like those moments that you're talking about where people meet each other and recognize each other emotionally, and I think about, again, it's dance, right? As a former dancer, but not even just a performing dancer, like as somebody who can be at the club dancing for hours upon hours, or down the road during carnival or whatever it is, those moments where you just feel in your body to have been liberated, and I think if you have felt that in one way or another, if you have felt that you can recognize that feeling either through a dialogue with somebody else or through an embodied action. I mean, I sometimes joke with my grad students that it took going to grad school to learn that knowledge production was not embodied, participatory, and collaborative, because that's what I had been doing in the arts. And so, of course, that's how we produce knowledge. But anyway, I mean, I think if you feel that, you're always trying to get back to that feeling, and as you try to realize that feeling again, I think that's when you can build also the theory about it.
I mean, just to think about even this past weekend, like the collective feeling that a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people, and no, actually, even the folks who are unhappy with, the result of the election, the collective sadness and maybe anger and rage that those folks feel, that stuff has data in it and it has knowledge in it. And I sometimes I work at the Publics Lab, which is kind of initiative at the Graduate Center where we train doctoral students who are in the humanities, social sciences very early on in their process to kind of lift up public scholarship and think about how they can use it in a variety of careers. So folks who are thinking about higher ed, but maybe not. And so it's like support them in that instead of people feel like they have to hide the fact that they're getting a PhD and may not be professors. And so often I say to them and their faculty mentors, how does doctoral education and graduate training look differently if we censor emotional wellness? So many of us, whether faculty or staff who are connected to higher ed and make higher ed a run, or graduate students, are depressed and anxious and have, terrible strategies and experiences with mental health. And why is it that doctoral training and the academy and anthropology make us feel the ways that we feel? If you can think back to like Saturday and that collective experience of jubilation that some people have, what does it look like to create a knowledge-making, knowledge-producing process that feels like that? And I've felt it before. When I go to ABA meetings at AAA, many a times I am in the room and I feel that collective joy. When I'm with, my sister scholars, some of them who are now real friends, like friends I would be with outside the academy, I feel that collective like joy, that collective feeling of possibility, that collective like we can build something anew. If that was central to how we train our graduate students and we train future anthropologists, how could anthropology look completely different?
Yeah.
But that's not a feeling. That's not only a feeling thing. That is a resource. That is a resource question. That is a question about power dynamics. That's a question of either burning anthropology down or at least uprooting a lot of things that make us not feel that as we're making knowledge. So I know we have questions.
We do. Let's see. Leah James says, thank you so much for this. Hello from an accidental anthropologist from Jamaica. The pursuit of happiness inspired one primary question me. What is post-colonial? How do we decenter Black suffering in the study of Black history? How do we move into that next anthropological turn wherein we can speak about Blackness outside of the legacy of colonialism? And is trying to jumpstart this change naive?
Leah, this is we could write like 5 books here, Leah. I feel you. I feel your energy and your passion in here. I don't know what post-colonial.
You must have written it.
What happened?
You must have written it.
Did I?
Well, she's saying the pursuit of happiness inspired this question. What is post-colonial?
Well, then, Leah, you don't have to tell me what that answer to that question is. But I do think, I think I wrote that book about Black women and happiness and travel to Jamaica because I wanted to begin, and not that other people haven't done it, but I wanted to begin to have an anthropological conversation about what it would mean to talk about Blackness, race, and gender without suffering being the central place to start that conversation. And, I give credit to the women that I, studied and worked with along those years. They're the ones who said, the US is somewhere where we feel like happiness is not accessible to us. And so with the little money that we have and the the citizenship privilege that we have to be able to be mobile and move, we're gonna go find happiness and experience it somewhere else. And so they led me to really think about what it meant to think about Blackness in the context of leisure and recreation and happiness. And it's funny, you know, academics are critical people. We have a hard time with joy and happiness, generally speaking. Even at those conferences where all of us are like studying affect, like it's some of the most neutral, like emotionless spaces, as if experiencing joy and leisure and like talking about leisure, like talking about not being busy, but actually sitting still and engaging in recreation will do something to our ability to create knowledge. And so, yeah, I don't know that I can answer your questions, Leah, but I do think we should spend more time thinking about who Black people are, what the Black community is, what does justice and equity and power look like alongside these notions of joy and happiness. And thankfully, the Movement for Black Lives has done a great job at pushing that conversation forward. I mean, you know, I started this research, I don't know, over 15 years ago. Oh my gosh. But the Movement for Black Lives sped the entire country up in having real conversations about mental wellness and emotional wellness. Esther Arma, who's in Ghana right now, has that great idea of emotional justice, and people like Prentice Hemphill are theorizing healing justice, to really understand that justice isn't only about legislative change or like policy, it's about us feeling in the everyday emotional wellness. So
I think you know, I'm going to tackle the point about post-colonial a little bit, because I think what you're asking for, Leah, is a new optic, you know, that if we are going to argue that the idea of the post-colonial is a fallacy, like there's no moment in which we have suddenly become post-colonial, then it seems like what you want to imagine is a new rubric, like a new container for thinking about the human condition, you know, in modernity. So I don't think we can think about Blackness outside of colonization, but I do, you know, I'm not, I don't see the space of Blackness as only the space of death, right? The space of inevitable degradation and dispossession, and not in that way where people say, oh, even in the face of structural marginalization, dispossession, and violence, people are doing stuff. It's not that, right? But I think when we are focused on the everyday ways that people create happiness, create joy, create life in their communities and in their families, one has to tilt in that direction of advancing the theoretical position of life, you know. And I think that's what a post-colonial rubric could be. It's not dispensing with the critical apparatus that allows us to understand modernity as being grounded in indigenous dispossession and African slavery, but instead sees all the various ways people have created joy, created spaces to elaborate their own institutional forms, and in the kind of everyday, not just the big political movement, that's what creates a new theory of life, you know, Black life and Black joy in the wake, as Christina Sharp would say, or in the wake of the plantation, which is, you know, what I've been writing about. But, you know, that would be a dispositional shift, I think.
So as you're saying that, I'm thinking we spend a lot of time thinking about Blackness as death, but if we think about Blackness as living, then how does that change our conversations? So I'm thinking about, you know, during the pandemic, you know, D Nice. I think
oh my God, those were so good.
D Nice saved lives, like in being able to feel connected to other people and in ways of experiencing the joy of dancing and music. You know, D-Night, I remember the first weekend of the pandemic when I was in my apartment, like stuck here, collectively watching Beyonce's Homecoming with other folks, like just the ways that Black folks lean into the living when it's hard, like find ways to get together and be together, and to be able to find and create joy is so important. And so if we think about Blackness as living, like how does that change our conversation about race? Yeah.
I think it's similar with anthropology too. You know, after the webinar that we did with Ryan on, you know, the case for letting anthropology burn, I was at Indiana University giving a talk and meeting with grad students, many of whom had also been at that webinar. And one of the grad students asked, okay, we all understand the critical dimension of what needs to be done, you know, to transform the foundations of the field. But if it's burning down, like, what do you run out of the house with? You know, and then we brainstormed a kind of list of all of the things that keep us in anthropology or draw us to anthropology, that if we in fact grounded anthropology in those things, what might it look like? You know, and I think that's sort of the next moment of that particular theorization as well, that we will try to elaborate in other kinds of events and with other collaborative you know, organizations, is, you know, how does one move from grabbing something as you're running out the house to building a new house with that something?
I'm just looking at the other questions. I see a question about mentoring. So a question about mentoring the next generation. What about the current climate when admissions are suspended at some institutions and austerity may shift student experiences? Additionally, how can we move from a place of theory to praxis within the field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are the questions. Admissions are suspended at Penn across arts and sciences for this year. Next year is uncertain, and I think it does obviously, you know, really shift how we are thinking about developing the next generation. And we are a wealthy elite institution, you know, so the kinds of problems that we're facing are just, you know, compounded exponentially in other kinds of spaces. I think one thing that's been really interesting is watching the grad students who are currently in their third, early fourth year, whose projects were derailed in one way or another by the pandemic, watching them retool and come to different kinds of ideas, or elaborate a different orientation for an idea that was already in the earlier project, has been quite fascinating. There's one student in our department who just had his oral exams and defended his prospectus, who was working on some kind of Maya revitalization through a cultural organization that was also focused on health and public health within communities in California, migrant communities in California, who has now retooled to do an incredible project on the sort of creation, the conceptual creation of the Maya within anthropology, which of course brings in our department, our museum, you know, the Peabody, and a couple other institutional locations. And that, to me, is such a productive kind of transformation that was impelled by the pandemic, but that ends up doing the very decolonial work that we've been calling for and that he wanted to do in his own community in California, you know. And so that kind of a shift, you know, people having to sort of think about where they are and what they can unearth in these spaces. I mean, Penn is certainly one of those spaces, as over 100 years old in the museum, the department. There are many, many, many decolonial projects to be done in this space. So that is, I think, one example of something that's been positive that has come out of this moment. You know, the gaps that the students will have in terms of cohorts and community sort of moving forward are, you know, things that we have to be thinking about now. I don't know, what do you think, Bianca? Even it's more precarious and, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the graduate students now are dealing with circumstances that are kind of tough to think about altogether. Like when I think about addressing that issue, there's so many different issues that are at play and forces that are at play that it's tough. I think I try my best to offer to students, like, there are ways that the previous generations got through, and while we don't have the same circumstances, that the type of practices and communities of support that we have, you can have those too. And so I think if Baker is asking kind of how does this work or my theorizing show up in my mentoring, I try my best to introduce folks not only to the thinkers and the texts that they need for their research projects, but open them up and introduce them to the communities that they need within higher ed and anthropology. And so again, like you and John Jackson and Lee Baker were so generous in not only the teaching in the classroom, but when I went with you all to conferences, like you all created space for me. And I talk about you all a lot in creating covering. There was a lot of covering, like when the anxiety of higher ed makes you feel like failure is something shameful, that experimentation is something that you shouldn't do. And I wish we spent, particularly in anthropology, spent more time encouraging that notion of like, try this, and if it doesn't work, try something else. That failure, that kind of space for whatever happens that we offer in field work. In field work, we know stuff is going to happen and it's going to move you around. We don't actually hold on to that in the other parts of our training. And so I say to graduate students, and I hope I create space for them to like fail and make mistakes without feeling a great deal of shame throughout their training, introducing them to community that's going to support them through their process and through mistakes and failures, and know that they will figure it out. And then like teaching them and showing them how to organize. I mean, many of my students organize already, so they already know, but there's something that happens when you enter higher ed and you think, oh, those tools out there don't apply in here. And I get really frustrated with them. Like, no, like this is a place where you need to use the tools that you use, you know, during the movement for Black Lives protests. Figure that out in your department. Figure out what that tool looks like to get the resources and to get access to the things that you need. And I think sometimes they create this binary where they don't think those tools apply. Yes, it comes with great costs. Yes, there's the same forces that are out there are in here fighting against you, but those tools can be useful inside higher ed. So I think there's a lot of organizing that needs to happen within higher ed that's not necessarily currently happening. And I do believe that graduate students, I don't want to put it on y'all, but in many ways, you all have more awareness of some of the walls and challenges that even as someone who just recently got to this other side of tenure, like I can't see, or I'm not experiencing in the same way. And so there's ways I can learn from you all.
Yeah.
So I'll just say that.
Yeah. Wait, one other thing on that though, too. I mean, I think generally, and I'm sure this is across institutional spaces, the predominant feeling right now, I think among grad students is like profound anxiety.
Yeah. And exhaustion.
Exhaustion, anxiety, fear about the future. Many of them are taking care of family and dealing with, you know, cyclical traumas in different kinds of ways. So I think, you know, as people are organizing and trying to sort of land on, you know, things that they are articulating at the moment as demands, you know, that a department may or may not be able to meet. I think what needs to happen is, you know, for departments to really think about like what is, again, like what is at the root of the critique, the demand, the anxiety? Why are people not feeling cared for? And what can we do to create that care in a way that is legible and tangible? And I think that's what's important right now.
And it requires people with a lot of privilege and power to even think that care is important, right? Like that you being a graduate student in the department and figuring it out on your own is actually not how it should be. That as like people who are bringing you into a discipline, into higher ed, into a career, that, you know, yes, you're adults and like you get to, you know, make your world the way you want to, but there are certain structural and institutional things that should be in place to help offer care. And in the same way, you know, I've talked to some of my colleagues who, those of us who like theorize affect and emotion and care and really do care about that emotional labor. There is this block, there's a lack of grace that is happening across generations. And, you know, in this moment of emergency and the pandemic and a lot of Black death, what has come up for me is like, how can we create more grace for one another? I think there's an assumption that when particularly folks of color, but especially Black folks, get to that other side of tenure, or are editors of big time journals, or are in charge of, you know, funding agencies, that somehow magically we just can do it and like make it different. And you know, the higher you get and or the deeper you get into the monster, the belly of the beast, there's things that you see that you couldn't see when you weren't in that position. And so sometimes I wish we had both more grace for our students and all the things that they're really experiencing, and that they had some grace with us around what we actually have the ability to do or not. So that's probably more communication, more vulnerability and bravery, and more solidarity. We have to work on that. I see, Yarimar, your question about, I'm wondering what you guys think about the decision of the U-Chicago English department to only accept PhD students working in Black studies for next year. Would it be feasible or advisable for an anthropology department to do something like that in this moment of emergency? Or do you imagine a different kind of policy or practice for the current moment within anthropology graduate programs?
I didn't know that about Chicago, that was what was decided.
I did know about this, and I will say I haven't thought deeply about it, Yarimar. So I don't, but when I saw it, I did let out a little cheer of joy. And like, yes.
Yeah.
One, because their statement alongside that decision was so well written and so intentional. Like they had a great reasoning and rationale and commitment. Like there was an awareness of a history. It wasn't just like, in this moment of emergency, we're going to do this to solve this problem. It was an analysis of how their program and their institution had contributed to a problem, and that this is what their attempt was, their experiment to try to address that. And I think there should be more experiments like this. We won't know if this was a good thing or an effective thing until maybe next year, or until those graduate students make it through the program. But I do think graduate programs should be experimenting and having some real conversations with their faculty about what their department's stated mission and values are, and how they're actually practicing those things. So when departments tell me, when I see all these diversity statements and wonderful words that were released in the past few months, my first question is always, okay, your department says it's anti-racist. What does that look like? Give me the evidence. How is anti-racism present in how you accept your graduate students and enroll your graduate students? How is anti-racism present in how you hire people in your department? And affirmative action is not the answer to that. That's not the answer. So I think we should be experimenting. I think that will require some work and some faith. And I hope we're able to do more of it.
But even I think also in very subtle ways. I mean, you're pointing out, Bianca, the kind of big obvious structural numbers and, you know, stuff like that. But also, you know, it has to do with canon. Like, what are the canons that are being taught as the intro or the social theory or in Chicago, what's it called? Systems. You know, like what are the who are the authors? You know, what is the body of anthropological knowledge that is valued, not taught and then said, well, and you know, but this is the counter archive or the counter canon, but like what is the body of knowledge, investigation, and theorization that is really valued at a center, you know? And I think that's a difficult one. People, you know, don't want to let go of structural functionalism and social, you know, and I think these things are also important to teach. It's just a matter of how, you know, and what is the relation that we're teaching when we're teaching them. But the other thing that I would think is a bit more subtle that your questions raise is has to do with methods, you know, and how are certain kinds of methods understood within the faculty, understood and evaluated within the faculty? How is something like autoethnography approached? You know, how do people learn to think about a project where somebody is working at home as or how do they think of that outside of the kind of rubric of objectivity, which I think still hangs on, even though many people have disavowed that, you know, as something, you know, that is something that's foundational to our study. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a really interesting experiment, and it will definitely create a cohort, you know, and a cohort that I would love to have been part of. But nevertheless, I will be interested to find out, you know, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years down the line, where that leads.
I know we're about to wrap up. I just want to say one more thing about that experiment. After I jumped for joy and seeing the statement and what I thought was a pretty good attempt at addressing something, I remember talking to one of my sister scholars about it, and we were talking about the amount of labor that cohort will most likely be doing for the faculty in that department, right? So everyone in that department is not ready, nor probably experts at teaching Black studies or critical race stuff or whatever the thing is that those students will need. And so I can imagine that there will be a lot of moments of various forms of harm and violence and misunderstandings and miscommunications that will happen as those students go through the process. And so I was hoping that English department was ready for the institutional change that will be required of them as those students go through the process. And I think in this moment of emergency, what we are seeing in the US and have been seeing in this last election is whether or not the US is ready for what the folks in the streets have been demanding and are requiring of this next moment. We will see if the Democrats are ready to do it. We will see if everyone can catch up, because, you know, in that moment of great change, whether it be in that department or more broadly, you know, it's a lot of harm that can happen, a lot of violence that can be experienced as people move towards change and equity and justice. So my heart and like my good energy is with those graduate students. And I also know it might be a little tough for them, you know, so that's what I'll say about that. Amalia, I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions. I'll just say I'm in New York. So if you want to email me and we'll have a conversation.
Oh, I missed that. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I know you couldn't see us as both of you were speaking, but there were just so many times, and I was just like, yes, like that's exactly what's happening. I was like taking notes, and so I just want to, I just want to thank both of you for such a remarkable conversation. Like, and thank you for doing all this work that you've been like for years that you've been doing, and that you continue to do. I think what I really appreciated with the stories, which informed your journeys in some sense, were how accessible it made it, right? And so I kept thinking to myself, I wish I had heard something like this when I was an undergrad. I wish I had heard something like this even when I was a grad student at Penn. You know, that would have just really radicalized and changed my ability or way of thinking or imagining myself. So I'm really happy that we have this as a recording for future generations. I can imagine a bunch of us using this in various ways to help with mentorship. And so thank you both, Deb and Bianca, for setting the standards of our discipline higher and showing us that we have the capacity to get there. And also, I was really struck by the different structural and behavioral changes both of you sort of indexed that can actually be made in the discipline or in our faculty meetings and in the world, right? So you kind of covered many different scales and many different spaces. So thank you for that. And to all of you who are viewing this, thank you for joining us on this webinar presentation by the Anthro section of the New York Academy of Sciences. Our next event is on December 9th, and it's entitled Indigenous Rights, Territory, and Advocacy, Anthropology's Colonial Legacy and Contemporary Vocation. For this event, we'll be joined by Janet Chernella and Patricia Ayala for a conversation moderated by Hugo Benavides. I hope you'll be able to join us for that important conversation as well. And then once again, thank you to both Professors Deborah Thomas and Bianca Williams, and to all of you who've attended this event from all across the globe. Be well and be safe. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.